or military intervention in the last 30 years that has led to peace. In fact, it escalated things. Secondly, that interests of armament and disarmament are in direct conflict these days. The vast expenditures on military R&D to land a bomb in the middle of my head because of my genetic material and all that research that is going on cannot be developing things that will lie fallow or dead in the future, because these are major investments. So the fact that a firm that produces hazmat suits, body bags, and refugee tents has some of the highest returns of investment in the world makes the situation even more complex. Third little point is that, yes, we understand in Africa and in Southern Africa that there were armed groups that thought that violence could be cathartic, including the ANC, at a certain point of the history, as opposed to, let's call them Neo-Gandhian movements from Nyerere to Nkrumah and others, where non-violent action. The turning point in South Africa, as we all know, was the decision and the realization that violence could not be cathartic and move towards reconciliation and also disarmament and other things. Now, this idea of violence could be cathartic, creates victors and victims and more armed groups and more troublesome people for regimes and more sales for arms that have been escalating at the same time. So all I'm trying to say is that unless, like in Europe, or like inside South Africa, the past was constituted as regrettable, and therefore one could proceed in countries that killed more people than anyone else on earth to be able to have a Pacific Europe over a few years after devastating wars. It was possible, it was done. So that all that was regrettable. We will not be able to construct a moral South-to-South cooperation. It will be a pragmatic one. End of comment.
Thank you very much. We would still have time for one or two more statements. That's not the case. We'll just come back to the panel, and you have the opportunity now to respond. Let's reverse the order, so we'll start with Dr. Kaustorff, please.
Thank you so much for these reflections. What I was sort of referring to an approach towards prevention of conflict, even and much early warning, using much early warning system, but also making investment that conflict does not arrive in first place. So the approach was more developmental approach, where if you look at how do we reduce the inequalities within the societies at the national and subnational context, and there comes the question of making South-South cooperation work. Of course, the responsibilities would be with the national government within their overall national developmental framework and the policy framework, but South-South cooperation with the development compact that we talk about can bring in more nuance development there, which can reduce inequality, poverty, and deprivation, and that would in a way sort of neutralize first conditions for having a conflict. Second is, of course, building strong democratic institutions, but not to stop there. Building capacities of the civil society, building capacities of citizens, so not only to support the representative democracy, but also building a participatory democracy within the society. So these are more preventive action, long-term actions towards addressing the question of preventing conflict even arise at the first place. Coming to, I don't think there was a difference in the definition, but Carlo talked about his presentation, but I think we emphasize two different aspects of the conflict. One is the conflict between countries, which is an international nature, but I focused more on the subnational conflict. But having said this, many a times there is a dynamics between international conflict and the subnational conflict. And subnational conflict often has a tendency to transcend the boundaries of the state border and to involve other countries, or vice versa. The international conflict can also initiate a subnational conflict. So conceptually speaking, they may feed each other in a bad way. So I don't see the definitional differences, but it's a continuum or dynamism that we need to understand.
Thank you, Professor Ruchita.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very interesting the way the discussion is going. And I would like to take on some of the points which were made by some of the questions that were raised. First, the question about early warning mechanisms and that the UN does not have. But other regional organizations like the African Union do have an early warning mechanism. They do have a panel of wise to deal with these issues. I'm not really sure how far it has really worked in the case of Africa, but there are mechanisms, because in Africa they have moved away from non-intervention towards a policy of non-indifference. So pragmatically, that's what they call for in terms of a resolution, an early resolution to a conflict. So there are several examples within Africa of how some of the regional organizations and in individual countries have been involved in conflict prevention, and maybe some of our participants here from Africa could tell us about that. But I would like to bring in the example of the IGAD, which has been involved in South Sudan in supporting capacity building of the Sudanese civil servants in terms of enhancing their governance capacities and thereby reducing the chances of conflict, because it's a new nation and it needs to develop that. That's an important initiative. And the 3 countries which have been seconding their officials, Kenya, Uganda, and I'm not sure which is the 3rd country, but there are 3 African countries from the region which are basically involved in this. So this is again another example of how South-South cooperation is working. Secondly, this whole talk about reconciliation that you're talking of in terms of South Africa, but I'm not really sure that it's really working even now. In terms of South Africa, it is, but there are South Africa has several individuals which are working on a counter purpose. So you have mercenaries, which have cases of mercenaries being involved in, say, the conflict in settled African Republic. Mercenaries of South African origin. So how do you deal with situations like that? Of course, the South African government has brought about a new model of reconciliation and conflict resolution, but how can it control the private citizens within its borders and their dealings with it? Second important aspect is about the whole issue of the fact that US is the largest exporter of arms, and how can you promote South-South cooperation in peace and conflict management if US is not on board, which is true. In fact, the US is the largest arms manufacturer. Its whole economy is based on manufacturing. So obviously there has to be some kind of mechanism among the southern countries in the global south to deal with these countries which are involved in promoting armaments, whether it is US or whether it is countries within Europe or China, which talks about building security in Africa, but also is one of the largest supplier of small arms to the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we need to rush up a little bit because in 2 minutes the next meeting will take place downstairs. So Mr. Deepak, please. No? Okay, thank you. And then we have the Carlos.
Just very quickly regarding what gentleman from South Africa said, reminds me of a very interesting article from Lutwak called "Give War a Chance." It's very interesting. I recommend reading. Thank you.
Okay, well, reflect on that one. And now, Mr. Dennis, you have the final word.
Thank you very much. There was mention of mechanisms in the United Nations system, including organs of the United Nations like the Security Council. I think these have existed, and what we're trying to say today is that the member states in the South can build upon the mechanisms that exist to promote peace and conflict prevention. And in this regard, I wanted to give a quick example of a number of fragile states that have been working to promote peace. They're called fragile to fragile states. And the idea is that they share experiences in terms of preventing conflicts from breaking out. And I think this is an example of what we're trying to say. As you say, the mechanisms are there. There are big countries exporting weapons and so on. But what can the South of tomorrow help in terms of bringing about peace? And I think the answer lies with the countries of the South. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please join me in giving a hand to the panelists for a great session. And thanks to all those that put up the questions and that listened and shared the session with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In all contexts, there was a sharp increase in inequality, economic, social, as well as political power between the subnational regions, either in the context of ethnicity or religions or religious sects, and people at large. So there's a clear-cut indicator where there is an increase in inequality. Second is perception of being subject to blatant injustice by certain sections by the people. So that's a perception by majority of the people or minority of the people that they are facing some injustice. And then marked deterioration of or undermining of democratic institutions and processes, which otherwise these institutions mediate between different interest groups and therefore reducing the chance of conflict. And fourth one is the dramatic deterioration of civic liberty and spaces for civil society. So these are some early warnings which could be seen in more or less across the globe in all the conflict regions. So indeed, the inequality and exclusion manifest most starkly in political policy arena related to the access to political power and governance, land, water, extractive resources, delivery of basic services, justice and security. So it is possible to predict whether the countries or a sub-region within a nation could get into a conflict region. So what are the new paradigm for peace building? Within this understanding, there is now a kind of paradigm shift in the way peace building and conflict management strategies are now being considered. First of all, this is premised on the understanding that violence and conflict cannot be resolved by short-term partial solutions. And in the absence of institutions that provide people with security, justice, and developmental opportunities. So the point made by Mr. Deepak is very pertinent here. This is perhaps true that the primary responsibility for preventing action to conflict rests with the states, particularly through their national policies. However, in today's context, states are often one actor among many. And states are increasingly called to work with each other and with other actors to keep their countries on a pathway to peace. So it is the ability or inability of the state to work with a range of actors within the national context is extremely important. And this is possible when there is a strong democratic state in place which can sort of mediate and take into consideration the interest of various conflicting groups. The third one is the nexus between development, peace, and security. And this takes concrete form towards an